All right, today we're diving into the arguments from a really provocative source called Debunking Islam, a Christian critique. This book takes direct aim at the foundational story of Islam, and we're going to unpack its arguments one by one to see exactly how it makes its case.
So the whole critique we're about to explore really hinges on challenging one big idea, which the source calls the standard Islamic narrative, or SIN for short. Now this is the core belief that Islam's origin story, the Quran, Muhammad's life, all of it, is not just true, but a divinely preserved, perfect historical record. The book frames its entire case against this central narrative.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the basic framework of the critique, then we'll dig into the questions it raises about the Quran, and then about Muhammad himself. After that, we get into a pretty wild theory about Islam's holy city, then cover some alleged errors, and finally, we'll see how the book pulls it all together into one big argument.
Okay, let's dive into that first part. If you're going to challenge a massive, foundational story like this, where do you even begin? Well, according to our source, you start with the most foundational thing of all.
That's right, the Quran itself. The book's argument kicks off with a really big question. Does the evidence we actually have, historical records, textual analysis, does it really back up the claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved, completely unchanged from the very beginning?
The standard belief, the orthodox view, is pretty clear. The Quran you can hold in your hands today is the word-for-word, unaltered message from God as it was revealed to Muhammad. This idea of perfect preservation is an absolute cornerstone of the faith. But, and this is the book's big but, the author argues that if you look at some of the earliest Islamic traditions, they seem to tell a different story.
And this is where things get really fascinating. To challenge that idea of perfect preservation, the book points to a specific story, a hadith, which is a recorded tradition from Muhammad's own wife, Aisha. The story goes that some verses about stoning were written on a piece of paper she kept under her bed. But after Muhammad passed away, a goat got into the house and, well, it ate the paper. The verses were gone. So the author asks, if part of the revelation could be lost because of a household goat, how does that square with the idea of a perfectly divinely protected text?
This timeline really drives home another one of the book's key arguments. The author calls it the textual gap. Just think about it. Muhammad dies in 632, but it's not until almost 2 decades later, around 650, that Caliph Uthman standardizes the Quran and orders all other versions to be burned. And then, the hadith collections, the stories and sayings that give so much context, they aren't compiled for another 200 years. The book's point is that this huge gap in time leaves a lot of room for things to change, for material to be lost, or for variations to creep in.
And that textual gap isn't just about the book. The source argues it's also about the man. This leads us right into the next part of the critique, which shifts focus from the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad himself. It starts asking, what do we really know about his life, historically speaking? And what about the claim of his infallibility? A major point the book brings up is the satanic verses incident. Now, this isn't some modern theory. The source points to early Islamic historians like al-Tabari, who recorded it. The story goes that Muhammad briefly recited verses that appeared to praise 3 local pagan goddesses. He later retracted them, saying that Satan had whispered them to him, not God. For the author, this is a huge deal. If the prophet could be momentarily deceived, what does that mean for the idea of prophetic infallibility?
From there, the critique kind of zooms out to look at the bigger historical picture, and it points out some things that are pretty startling. For one, there are no accounts of Muhammad written while he was actually alive. None. The very first full biography we have was written more than 130 years after he died. So based on that lack of first-hand evidence, and what the book sees as a big shift in his portrayal from a peaceful preacher to a military leader, the source explores a pretty radical idea. Maybe the traditional Muhammad is a composite figure, a blending of different historical people or legends into one single narrative.
All right, hold on, because now we're getting into what is maybe the most provocative argument in the entire book. It's a claim that challenges the very geography of early Islam, suggesting its sacred center wasn't where we think it was.
The book poses this massive question. What if Islam's original holy city wasn't Mecca? And his proposed answer is pretty mind-blowing, that the city actually described in the Quran is the ancient city of Petra in modern-day Jordan.
And here's the evidence the book lays out. Just look at this comparison. The Quran describes a place with olive trees and fruit, a place near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The source argues that this fits Petra perfectly. It was a fertile trading hub just 80 kilometers from the Dead Sea. But Mecca, it's an arid desert valley over 1,000 kilometers away. But here's the real bombshell.
The author cites research showing that all known mosques built before 750 AD aren't oriented toward Mecca. They're oriented to face Petra.
Okay, moving on from that massive geographical claim, the book then shifts gears to point out what it calls specific errors inside the Islamic texts themselves. Think of this next part as a rapid-fire round of alleged inconsistencies, factual, historical, and logical.
First up, a historical one. In the Quran, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is addressed as the sister of Aaron. The book flags this as a major anachronism, since Aaron, the brother of Moses, lived more than 1,000 years before Mary was born. The source presents this as a significant historical error.
Next, the source identifies what it claims is a scientific error. The Quran states that sperm originates from a place between the backbone and the ribs. The book argues this is simply anatomically incorrect, and that it reflects the medical understanding of the 7th century, not timeless divine knowledge.
And then there's what the book sees as a logical contradiction. It juxtaposes the famous verse stating, "There is no compulsion in religion," with other verses that command believers to fight those who do not submit to Islam. The author argues these two directives create a fundamental tension within the text.
So, after presenting all these different lines of evidence, textual, historical, geographical, and logical, the book starts to bring them all together. This final section is all about the methodology, how it pieces together its overall critique. The source's final approach is to build what it calls a cumulative case. It isn't relying on a single gotcha moment. Instead, it's about layering its arguments, just like you see here. It starts by challenging textual perfection, moves to questioning the historical foundations, and then points out internal inconsistencies. The ultimate conclusion the author draws from this combined evidence is that Islam is of human rather than divine origin.
And this brings us to our final, big-picture question. What we've just walked through is a form of deep, historical, critical analysis applied to a sacred text, and so it leaves us with this question. What is the role of this kind of critique in understanding any faith? How does weighing historical evidence against traditional narratives shape our view of religion and maybe even truth itself? Definitely something to think about.